Chapter 7. Flop. The nervous system's final resort, the ancient mercy of collapse, and what it means to go offline in order to survive. Definition. Flop is the nervous system's last resort survival strategy, a state of collapse, shutdown, and the cessation of active response that occurs when all other options have been exhausted or were never available. It is what the system selects when fight cannot overpower the threat, flight cannot escape it, freeze cannot wait it out, fawn cannot appease it, and friend cannot provide sufficient co-regulation. In that moment of absolute resource exhaustion, the nervous system does not simply fail. It activates a very old, very deliberate program, one that is found in virtually every vertebrate species and that has been maintained across hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history because it works, in the specific conditions for which it was designed. It conserves resources, suppresses the experience of pain, and sometimes, by simulating death, removes the organism from the threat's interest entirely. The distinction between freeze and flop is critical and is frequently confused, even in clinical contexts. Freeze is a high activation state. The body is flooded with sympathetic stress chemistry, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, and held rigidly immobile by simultaneous inhibitory signals. It is braced, watchful, internally tense, and can shift rapidly into fight or flight if conditions change. Flop is a low activation state. The sympathetic chemistry has been overridden by the ancient parasympathetic system, heart rate and breathing slow dramatically, muscles go limp rather than tense, and the person may lose consciousness or enter a state that is indistinguishable from unconsciousness by an outside observer. Freeze is the car running at full throttle with the brakes on. Flop is the car running out of fuel entirely and rolling to a stop. Polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, provides the most precise neurobiological framework for understanding flop. Within this framework, flop corresponds to the activation of the dorsal vagal system, the oldest, most phylogenetically ancient branch of the vagus nerve, present in all vertebrates and responsible for the immobilization and shutdown responses. Porges describes the nervous system in terms of a hierarchy: ventral vagal, social engagement, safety, sympathetic, mobilization, fight/flight, and dorsal vagal, immobilization, shutdown, and flop is the expression of dorsal vagal dominance when all higher options have failed. Neurobiology. The neurobiology of flop centers on the dorsal vagal complex, the unmyelinated, evolutionarily ancient branch of the vagus nerve that is distributed throughout the subdiaphragmatic viscera and that governs the vegetative functions of the organs below the diaphragm. Unlike the ventral vagal system, which is myelinated, meaning it transmits signals quickly and can be modulated rapidly, and which governs social engagement and the fine-tuned regulation of the heart and lungs, the dorsal vagal system is unmyelinated, slower, and more binary in its action. It essentially applies a massive brake to the entire system, slowing heart rate, reducing breathing, suppressing digestive activity, and dropping metabolic activity dramatically. The evolutionary origins of the dorsal vagal system predate the evolution of mammals by hundreds of millions of years. In fish and other early vertebrates, the dorsal vagal system governs the diving response and the death feigning response, the ancient strategy of becoming metabolically minimal in order to survive conditions of extreme threat or resource scarcity. When the mammalian nervous system inherits this ancient system and activates it under conditions of inescapable threat, the result is flop, a dramatic, system-wide deceleration that produces the characteristic presentation of collapse, limpness, unresponsiveness, and the pale, cool skin of a person who is not adequately perfusing their periphery. The polyvagal ladder concept, Porges' metaphor for the hierarchical arrangement of neural states from most ventral vagal, safest, most engaged, to most dorsal vagal, most shut down, places flop at the very bottom rung. The implication is important. Getting from flop to function is not a single step but an ascent of the entire ladder, moving first from dorsal shutdown towards sympathetic activation, which feels, paradoxically, like a return of distress before it becomes regulated, and then from sympathetic activation toward ventral vagal regulation and genuine function. This is why recovery from deep flop takes time and cannot be rushed without triggering overwhelm. Chemistry. The chemistry of flop is as distinctive as its neurobiology, and understanding it helps explain some of the most puzzling features of the state. The dramatic reduction in sympathetic activation that characterizes FLOP is mediated by the dorsal vagal system's release of acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic system, which acts directly on the heart and other organs to slow their activity. This reduction in sympathetic chemistry produces an equally dramatic shift in the felt experience. The urgency, the heat, the force of the sympathetic states gives way to something much quieter and much stranger. Endorphins and opioid-like compounds, the brain's own internal pain management system, are released in significant quantities during FLOP. This neurochemical event is the biological basis of the distinctive quality that many FLOP experiences carry: a strange peace, a profound distance from pain, a sense of hovering just outside the worst of what is happening. This is not spiritual, it is pharmacological. The brain is administering its own analgesic at the moment when the organism most needs protection from the experience of what is happening to it. This endorphin-mediated quality of FLOP is one of the reasons that some people, particularly those with trauma histories involving repeated FLOP activation, find the state strangely comfortable or even sought after. The chemistry produces a genuine, if temporary, relief from the pain and threat that preceded the collapse. The chemistry of recovery from FLOP involves the gradual reassertion of sympathetic tone, the slow return of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is why the process of coming out of deep FLOP often feels, paradoxically, like a return of distress. The person begins to feel again, and the first feelings to return are often the ones that the FLOP was protecting against: fear, pain, grief, overwhelm. This is normal, necessary, and important to understand, because the temptation to stop the recovery process at this point, because feeling bad again seems worse than the numb peace of the FLOP state, is a significant clinical challenge. Brain waves. The brainwave patterns of FLOP shift dramatically toward the slower end of the spectrum. Where the sympathetic states produce high beta activity, rapid, fragmented, threat-focused, FLOP produces a shift toward theta and sometimes delta waves. Theta waves, oscillating at approximately 4 to 8 cycles per second, are associated with a hypnagogic state at the edge of sleep, with deep meditation, and with the dreamy, dissociated quality of mild FLOP. Delta waves, the slowest of the normal brainwave rhythms, are typically associated with deep, dreamless sleep and with states of significantly reduced consciousness. The shift toward these slower brainwave states explains many of the most distinctive cognitive features of FLOP: the dreamlike quality, the sense of hovering at the edges of consciousness, the difficulty forming or retaining memories of the experience, and the fragmented or absent narrative that trauma survivors often carry about their most extreme FLOP experiences. Memory consolidation requires active neural processes, the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex working in coordination, and in the slow-wave state of deep FLOP, these processes are significantly impaired. This has profound implications for trauma survivors who are asked to give detailed accounts of experiences during which they were in deep FLOP. The absence of clear memory is not evidence that nothing happened. It is evidence of what happened neurologically during the experience. Psychology. The psychology of FLOP is best understood as the psychology of disappearance. The person in deep FLOP is not fully present in the ordinary sense. The self, as an experiencing subject, has receded to a great distance or has effectively absented itself from the experience. Dissociation, the splitting of consciousness from its ordinary continuity and integration, is the primary psychological expression of the dorsal vagal state, and it exists along a spectrum from the mild, I feel a bit unreal, I feel like I'm watching myself from a distance, to the severe, complete amnesia, fragmented identity, extended periods of blank non-experience. The relationship between FLOP and severe depression is one of the most clinically important in this entire map. The most severe presentations of depression, the ones in which the person lies in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing, unable to initiate even the simplest action, disconnected from relationships, from pleasure, from the sense of being alive, are not primarily psychological phenomena. They are physiological states of dorsal vagal dominance in which the nervous system has collapsed to its minimum metabolic baseline. Understanding severe depression as a FLOP state rather than as a mood disorder reframes both its treatment and its meaning. The person is not failing to feel better because of a character deficiency or a lack of will. They are in a state that their nervous system selected at some point as the only remaining option, and they need, at the physiological level, the slow, careful, warmth and resource-first approach that flop recovery requires, not the cognitive demands of a system that is still far above their current regulatory capacity. Behavior. What flop looks like from the outside is distinctive and, once recognized, unmistakable. In its acute form, tonic immobility, the collapse state associated with inescapable threat, the person may appear to be unconscious or deeply asleep while technically awake. Their muscles are limp rather than tense. Their skin may be pale or even slightly bluish from the reduction in peripheral blood flow. Their eyes may be open but unfocused or closed. Their breathing is shallow and slow. If someone touches or moves their limbs, there is little or no resistance. This is not the braced stillness of freeze. It is the total limpness of a system that has gone offline. In its chronic form, the flop of burnout, severe depression, or chronic dorsal vagal dominance, the behavioral presentation is less dramatic but equally significant. The person continues to exist, to go through the motions of daily life, but with a characteristic quality of absence from their own experience. They may describe feeling nothing, or feeling as though they are behind glass, watching their own life unfold with no sense of participation or authorship. They may be unable to experience pleasure. The neurochemical machinery of hedonia is dampened in the dorsal state. They may be unable to make even simple decisions. They may be unable to maintain basic self-care without prompting and support. And they may appear to a casual observer to be simply unmotivated or uninterested, when in fact they are in a state of profound physiological shutdown that is as involuntary as any acute trauma response. Spiritual and inner experience. The inner experience of deep flop has been described by survivors and clinicians as having a quality that is genuinely difficult to place within ordinary categories of experience. It is not sleep, though it resembles it. It is not peace, though the pain is absent. It is not death, though it touches something of the quality that death is sometimes imagined to have, the absolute cessation of the ordinary business of being a self. The philosopher Simone Weil, writing from a very different context, described the moment of extreme suffering in which the ordinary self dissolves as a kind of grace, a forced meeting with the ground of being beneath the constructed identity. While her context was spiritual and voluntary and flop is involuntary and physiological, the territory they describe has genuine overlap. Coming back from deep flop, the gradual, tentative return of sensation, of color, of the sense of being inside one's own body, is described by many survivors as having a quality that resembles being born. Things that were previously taken completely for granted, the feel of sunlight on skin, the taste of food, the sound of a voice, arrive with a freshness and intensity that is both disorienting and profoundly moving. This re-emergence is not guaranteed, it is not automatic, and it does not happen on a schedule that the person or their supporters can control. But when it happens, it carries a quality of genuine renewal that is unlike any other experience available to the human nervous system. Understanding flop as a state from which genuine return is possible, and supporting that return with patience, warmth, and the restoration of safety, is one of the most important contributions that an understanding of the F responses can make to human well-being. Mechanisms. The mechanism by which flop is triggered involves the activation of the dorsal vagal complex in response to conditions that the nervous system assesses as representing imminent death or as exceeding the total capacity of the sympathetic system to manage. This assessment is not cognitive. It is a rapid, automatic, subcortical evaluation conducted largely by the periaqueductal gray and the amygdala. When the determination is made, the dorsal vagal system essentially overrides the sympathetic activation, though the sympathetic chemistry remains in the bloodstream, and produces the massive parasympathetic brake that defines flop. The opioid system is central to the sustainability of the flop state. The flooding of endorphins and opioid-like compounds that accompanies dorsal vagal activation creates both the pain suppression and the psychological distance from experience that allow the state to be maintained without the overwhelming distress that would otherwise accompany the circumstances that produced it. This same opioid involvement is one reason why some people find the flop state genuinely difficult to leave. The chemistry of collapse is genuinely comfortable in a way that the re-emergence into sympathetic activation, with its return of feeling, of pain, of fear, is not. Recovery from flop is driven by the gradual re-establishment of sympathetic tone and the eventual engagement of the ventral vagal system. Trembling, sighing, gasping, warmth, gentle movement, the presence of a safe other, all of these provide input to the nervous system that begins the recovery sequence. The process requires time, and it cannot be rushed without triggering a return to flop or a destabilizing overactivation of the sympathetic system. The body is doing something very specific and very important during flop recovery, and the most helpful thing that can be offered is patient, warm, non-demanding presence that gives the system the safety it needs to begin its own ascent. Triggers. Flop is triggered by the conditions that the nervous system assesses as representing the endpoint of all other options: extreme physical overwhelm, including injury and pain beyond the capacity of the sympathetic system to manage, inescapable perceived death or destruction, severe trauma accumulation in which the system has been in high activation for so long that it has exhausted its sympathetic resources, and the re-triggering of flop states from earlier overwhelming experiences by stimuli that the nervous system associates with the original events. Chronic exhaustion is one of the most common and least recognized flop triggers in modern life. The person who has been in sustained fight or flight, in high sympathetic activation, for months or years, managing unrelenting demands, chronic stress, or unresolved trauma, is running down a resource that the sympathetic system does not have an infinite supply of. When that resource is exhausted, the system does not simply require a brief rest before returning to full function. It drops into dorsal vagal collapse, the clinical presentation of burnout, in which the person cannot perform functions they could easily manage before, cannot generate motivation or enthusiasm, and cannot understand why they feel nothing when they are surrounded by people who care about them and circumstances that should, by any reasonable measure, be generating more than this. Variations. The flop response exists across an enormous range of intensity and duration. At the most acute end, tonic immobility, the complete motor shutdown associated with inescapable threat or sexual assault, represents the most dramatic and physiologically complete expression of the state. The person in tonic immobility may be completely limp, unable to move any part of their body, with breath reduced to a minimum and heart rate dramatically slowed. This state typically lasts minutes to tens of minutes in its most acute form, though its psychological and neurological traces may persist for years. At the other end of the spectrum, mild dissociation during a painful conversation, the experience of briefly going away, of feeling slightly unreal, of being present but not quite, represents a very mild dorsal vagal influence that is common and often unnoticed. Between these extremes lie the trauma-bound chronic flop that presents as severe depression, the functional flop of burnout in which a person continues to perform the mechanics of their role while being completely offline inside, and the pharmacologically induced or spiritually sought dissolution of self-awareness that touches the same neural territory for entirely different reasons and with entirely different outcomes. Each variation requires its own specific approach, and the most important common principle across all of them is the recognition that flop cannot be addressed through demand, through logic, or through willpower, only through the gradual, patient restoration of safety, warmth, and resource. Misinterpretations. The misinterpretations of flop carry consequences that range from deeply personal to catastrophically unjust. The most serious is the interpretation of tonic immobility during sexual assault as passive consent. This misinterpretation has been used to invalidate the testimony of survivors in legal, social, and personal contexts, and the harm it has caused is incalculable. Tonic immobility is a documented, well-researched, involuntary physiological response to inescapable threat. The person who could not move, could not speak, could not resist was not making a choice. They were in a state in which choice was neurologically unavailable. This is not an interpretation or a theory. It is a physiological fact, and it should be as widely understood as any other basic biological reality. Chronic flop in the form of severe depression is routinely misread as laziness, lack of motivation, or self-indulgence, a failure of character rather than a failure of regulation. The person lying in bed feeling nothing is not choosing not to get up. They are in a physiological state in which the capacity for self-initiation is genuinely compromised. The appropriate response is not shame, pressure, or demands for performance, but the gradual provision of warmth, safety, and relational support that allows the nervous system to begin its own recovery. Dissociated states, the milder presentations of FLOP in interpersonal contexts, are frequently read as indifference, as not caring, or as deliberate withdrawal, when they are often the nervous system's automatic protective response to an overwhelming relational event. And severe FLOP that produces dramatic or unusual behavior is sometimes misread as manipulation or attention-seeking, when it is far more accurately understood as a nervous system in profound distress expressing its distress in the only available language. Long-term effects. The long-term consequences of unresolved or chronically activated FLOP are among the most serious and wide-ranging of any F response. Chronic dissociation, the persistent, pervasive disconnection from one's own experience, body, and relationships, is perhaps the most psychologically devastating long-term consequence because it removes the person from their own life while leaving the physical body in place. Severe depression, in its most entrenched presentations, represents chronic dorsal vagal dominance that has become the nervous system's default state, a condition in which the biological mechanisms of engagement, pleasure, motivation, and connection are all persistently suppressed. The physical consequences are extensive, because the dorsal vagal system governs the vegetative functions of the body. Chronic dorsal vagal activation produces impaired digestion. The vagal slowing of the enteric nervous system reduces gut motility, gastric acid secretion, and intestinal circulation, producing a wide range of digestive complaints including constipation, nausea, bloating, and reduced absorption of nutrients. Cardiac irregularities, including bradycardia, abnormally slow heart rate, and heart rate variability disturbances, may result from chronic dorsal vagal influence on cardiac function. Immune dysfunction is significant, as the chronic suppression of the sympathetic system removes the mild immune activation that it provides, while the chronic activation of the dorsal vagal system suppresses the inflammatory response in ways that may actually impair appropriate immune surveillance. Chronic fatigue conditions, including, for some individuals, the conditions labeled as chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, are thought by some somatic clinicians to involve significant dorsal vagal dysregulation. Real-world examples. The assault survivor who lay completely still, who could not move their hands, could not speak, could not push the other person away, and who has spent years since the event believing that their stillness meant something about their character or their desire, is carrying a profound misunderstanding of their own neurological experience. Their stillness was not consent, and it was not choice. It was tonic immobility, the nervous system's most ancient and most complete response to inescapable threat. The person with treatment-resistant depression who lies in bed staring at the ceiling feeling absolutely nothing, who cannot understand why everyone around them can motivate themselves to do the simplest things while they lie unable to begin, is in chronic dorsal vagal collapse. Their system has not failed. It has selected the only response that seemed available, and it needs warmth and safety before it can begin the slow ascent back toward regulation. The burnout executive who cannot make the simplest decision, who was once capable of managing complex systems across multiple domains and now sits at their desk staring at an inbox they cannot begin to open, is in functional FLOP, the state in which the outer motions of function are maintained while the inner experience is one of complete absence. The child who goes limp and absent during episodes of family violence, who appears to have gone away, who does not cry, does not struggle, does not seem to register what is happening, is in tonic immobility, the nervous system protecting the child from the full horror of the experience by removing them from it as completely as it can. The veteran who lives what appears to be a normal life, goes to work, socializes, manages daily responsibilities, while feeling completely dead inside, as though watching his own life through thick glass, is in functional FLOP, and the absence of external drama makes his internal experience completely invisible to everyone around him. How to work with the response. Working with FLOP requires the most patience, the most gentleness, and the most body-first approach of any F response. The most important principle is this: you cannot think your way out of a dorsal vagal collapse. The cognitive faculties that are required for insight, for reflection, for making meaning of experience, are among the first casualties of the FLOP state. Bringing cognitive therapeutic tools to a person who is in significant dorsal shutdown is not simply ineffective, it may be actively disorienting, because the demand for cognitive engagement may exceed the current capacity of the system and produce further overwhelm or deeper collapse. Physical warmth is perhaps the single most immediately accessible and effective first response tool for FLOP. Warmth, a warm blanket, warm hands, a warm room, warm water, activates the ventral vagal system through the same thermoreceptors that respond to the warmth of a trusted other's body, and it begins, at the physiological level, to signal the possibility of safety. Gentle touch, where it is welcome and safe, produces similar ventral vagal activation. Gentle, slow, minimally demanding movement, being supported to stand, to slowly walk, to gently rock, begins to restore sympathetic tone without triggering the overwhelm of rapid activation. Light, gentle sound, and the proximity of a calm, regulated, non-demanding other are all powerful resources in the early stages of FLOP recovery. The critical instruction in all of this is slowness. The recovery from FLOP requires more time, more patience, and more gentleness than any other F-response transition, and attempting to rush it, out of anxiety, out of concern, out of frustration with the pace of progress, reliably produces setbacks. How to shift toward function. The shift from FLOP toward function is the longest journey in this map, and it is made step by step up the polyvagal ladder rather than in a single movement. The first step is not function, but rather the move from dorsal shutdown towards sympathetic activation, which means that the early stages of FLOP recovery look, paradoxically, like the return of distress rather than the arrival of regulation. As the dorsal brake releases and the sympathetic system re-engages, fear, pain, grief, and other previously suppressed states may become available. This is not a setback. It is a sign of recovery. The person is re-engaging with their own experience, and that re-engagement is the prerequisite for genuine regulation. Sensory input, light, warmth, gentle sound, the sensation of water, the smell of something familiar and safe, is the primary therapeutic resource in this early phase. Somatic experiencing and other body-based trauma therapies are specifically designed for this sequence, offering tools for moving very slowly up the activation ladder while maintaining sufficient safety that the system does not collapse back into dorsal shutdown or escalate into overwhelming sympathetic activation. The polyvagal ladder process, consciously moving from one state to the next, one small step at a time, with enough resource and support to sustain each step, is the most evidence-informed framework for FLOP toward function transition. The longer-term work involves the resolution of the accumulated overwhelm that originally triggered the FLOP state, the discharge of the threat chemistry that has been held in the system, the completion of interrupted survival responses, and the gradual building of a nervous system that has enough safety and resource that it no longer needs to go offline in order to survive. Integration notes. To integrate the FLOP response is to recognize and honor the extraordinary intelligence of a system that, in the face of absolute limit, found a way to protect the organism from the worst of what it could not otherwise survive. The FLOP response did not fail the person who experienced it. It succeeded. It kept them alive by doing the only thing left available to do. Honoring this, genuinely from the inside, is one of the most important acts of self-compassion available to someone carrying the history of a FLOP response, particularly one that has been judged harshly by themselves or others. Integration means developing enough safety, enough resource, and enough physiological support that the system no longer needs to disappear in order to survive. It means the gradual, patient, supported ascent of the polyvagal ladder to a place of genuine regulation. And it means the discovery, which comes, for many people, as a profound surprise, that on the other side of absolute collapse, on the other side of disappearance, there is still a self. That self may be quieter, humbler, and more intimately acquainted with limitation than the self that existed before. But it is present, and its presence, after the long absence of FLOP, can be experienced as one of the most remarkable and most quietly extraordinary events in a human life.